you should be able to identify this picture by the elements in the picture. Okay, that's a blimp on the left. What's that? What's the thing on the ground? Would it help you if I told you that the name of that blimp on the left is the Hindenburg? You're close. You're like right here. This is indeed the Hindenburg, which 9 months later will be in flames in New Jersey. 9 months later, that was in 1937, early 37. So this is summer of 1936, and what you see on the ground there is the gigantic stadium that was built for the 1936 Olympiad, for the Olympics, and I mean huge. That stadium right there could seat over 100,000 people. And so Berlin hosted the Olympics that year. And here's a side picture from the command module of the Hindenburg, taking a picture down on that, with on the day of the opening ceremonies. The stadium is full. It's just packed. And actually, you would figure it out if you saw this picture right here. So here's Hitler and some of the other people that were hosting the entire Olympics, starting the opening ceremonies. And you can see the stands. I mean, they're just packed. They're just packed. It's just huge. And of course, for Hitler, he was going to prove the fact that the Aryan race was quite superior in every physical way at these Olympics. That was what he was going to do. And so it sort of got turned on its head early on. The guy in the middle, you might know his name, Jesse Owens, came up with 4 gold medals. And doggone it, he's black. So this caused quite a stir. The guy on the far right he's actually German, Luz Long, and this is the award ceremony for the long jump. Jesse Owens was first, and Luz Long, the German on the left, or the right, came in second. But what's fascinating about this is that Jesse Owens and Luz Long both became very good friends, it turns out. Very, very good friends. And in fact, after the award ceremony here, they went off arm in arm off of the center of the award ceremony. And in fact, Luz Long, who was very Aryan and very German, became extremely good friends with Jesse Owens. And there's been some movies and some books written about it. In fact, Luz, which is actually a nickname, his real name is Carl, but Luz he made a deal with Jesse Owens that with the impending war that was coming up, they hadn't been in conflict yet, he made Jesse Owens promise that if Luz Long died in the war, that he would make contact with his son, Luz's son, and tell him about his dad and the Olympics and all that kind of stuff. And sure enough, Luz Long, he died in 1943 in the invasion of Sicily. And then after the war, Jesse Owens went and found his son and told him all about his dad. It's an amazing story. But I bring this up because when we get into Hebrews 12 today, he's going to paint us a picture that looks like this. This is the stadium on opening day. The stadium is full of people. And the image of the fact that there are people on the track that are running and competing, and the fact that there are so many onlookers is the metaphor that the writer of Hebrews uses to introduce us to why last time we were together, he gave us this whole parade of people from the Old Testament who through faith endured horrible circumstances and still pulled through to the end because they're looking forward to the promise that was to come. And so he says it's kind of like this. So this is how he starts off today in chapter 12. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, the ones he listed in chapter 11, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let's also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let's run with endurance the race that's set before us. It's a powerful image because what he's saying is, in a way, all those people in chapter 11, I don't know if they're actually looking down on us, but they have gone before us and they have demonstrated to the end of their lives a faith that looked for the promise to be revealed from God himself. That's where they were aiming. And so just like on a foot race, you know, if you start the race, you get down in the chalks. I always hated that feeling in high school. You get down in the chalks and you get all ready to go. You know, you sort of raise up and then boom, and the sound goes and you start running. You don't go just running off into the center field of the track. You stay on the track, you aim at the goal, and you pursue that. And that's really just very simply what the writer is saying. We need to pursue that goal, the realization of the promise of God that he has for us, this life with him. We need to pursue that just like a track runner has his eye on the goal and stays there. He doesn't get halfway through the race and then goes in the infield, finds a nice lawn chair, kicks back and goes, hey, this is a nice race that's going on. You don't do that because that's not the purpose of the race. The purpose of the race is to run the race and get to the end. And that's what he's saying these people in chapter 11 had done. And they put up with a lot of bad life in the midst of aiming towards the goal. From here to there, the track here in Berlin was very smooth, but in our lives, that track can be full of problems. And so that's what he's saying. You need to have that kind of single focus. And what is that focus? Boom, there it is. Looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. So what he's saying in a simple measure is that from the time of now until the time we die and we see Jesus face to face, we need to run the race well, but we have to keep our eyes on who's at the end of the race, just Jesus himself. So that's how he's introducing it here. And he's doing it in this model, which is just great. This Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him, now this is Jesus' track problems, let's put it that way. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So for Jesus himself, in the flesh, he ran this track, and he had a lot more obstacles on the track than either you or I will ever have. And yet, he endured to the end because he saw what the goal was. He saw what he was doing for all mankind. So we need to do the same thing is what he's saying. So this is really a call in chapter 12 to how we run the race from here to the end, keeping our eyes on Jesus. Okay, so he introduces that right at the top. So he says this, verse 3, still thinking about Jesus. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. I mean, can you imagine what it would have been like if Jesus put up with all this abuse from people, verbal and physical eventually? If he says, this is just not worth it. This is just wrong. I'm the Son of God and they're treating me so horribly. I think I just need to, stroll into the infield and say, hey, everything's off. It's not going to work. And even at the point of death when he's on the cross, he's being subjected to all this cruel stuff that people are saying. Well, if you are the Son of God, then come on down from there. Oh, he could save others, but he can't save himself. And so what he does, he endured that. He endured from sinners such hostility. So as he's saying, this is what I want to recommend to you from here, literally, from here to eternity. I want you to consider what Jesus did in his life from there to eternity and the obstacles he went through that brought such great gain to mankind and to us. You need to think that way as well in your life. In your struggle, the obstacles on your track, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Have you? No. So he's saying you need to stay on the track of life. You need to pursue Jesus as the goal with your eyes on him and know that there's a great prize at the end of all this from here to eternity, just like Jesus did. Okay, and he's going to continue to expand this as well. Look, have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? I guess I have, because I don't know what you're talking about, writer of Hebrews. Well, he says, I'll refresh your mind. Here's the exhortation that addresses you as sons. Now listen to this. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. Why? For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. That's from Proverbs 3. So he's saying, if you're running on this track of life from here to eternity and you run into obstacles, get used to it. In fact, it might be deliberate on God's part. No, actually, it is deliberate on God's part. And he qualifies it right here. Look, it is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. So, and by the way, sons or daughters, that's the same thing. So if you are his child, then you need to expect the fact that he's going to discipline you. Now, we have parents that disciplined us, and he'll talk about that in a second. And while they're disciplining us, was anyone in favor of the discipline? No. However, if you grow up a spoiled brat, is what we call them, where their parents do not discipline at all, and then you grow up and you become an adult, and you look at how far short you've come in terms of developing as a real human being, you get angry at parents who are that permissive. You get angry at them. And you hate the fact that they just didn't stop you and say, don't let this part of who you are go into your maturity in life. Yes, that's got to be left behind. You need to become an adult, so I'm going to discipline you on this issue. Well, after the fact, not during the fact, but after the fact, we look back and we go, oh, thank you that my parents were strict on this and they disciplined me on this. And why did they do that? Because they're power hungry? No, it's because they loved us. So this is what he's saying. If you're on this track of life with these obstacles you're constantly running into, it's not a smooth run. There's problems all the time. You need to consider the fact that this is God treating you like his child. Now, when I look back in my life and I see some of those hurdles on the track that I've gone through, which were extremely painful, I simultaneously, as I look back on them, say, wow, that really created some incredible gold in my nature. God used that. And he had to do something that extreme to make it happen. But secondly, I say to myself, but I never want to do that ever again. You know what I mean? And yet, when you look forward, there's probably a few more to come. You're his child, and he's disciplining you. Well, disciplining you in what kind of a way? I mean, for what purpose? Why is he disciplining? For what purpose? Just to make you a stellar, exemplary human being? No, there's more going on than meets the eye in this discipline stuff. And he'll mention this now. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline, right? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, we've all participated in that from our parents, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. So if you are expecting as a believer in Jesus, if you're expecting that the track is going to be smooth and the running is going to be easy, you're wrong, because that's what an illegitimate child expects. But a real child, a real son, ought to expect there be obstacles because the father disciplines the ones he loves. Okay, so bumps in the road are on purpose. I met with a friend this week down Salt Lake, and he went through a really bumpy, how shall I say, a bumpy disconnect from his church in Salt Lake City. He had worked for the church for nearly 25 years as an administrator in the church school that was attached to the church, and then as a youth pastor, and then some other executive level pastor things. I mean, he was part of this church for like forever. And then they up and told him last spring, well, I'm sorry, you don't work here anymore. Now that's a really hard thing to take, and had nothing to do with demonstrated sin or any of those just grotesque issues. It was just like, well, that's the end of it all. And so I've kept in contact with him over the year, and it was time just to go down and have coffee with him and just talk. And as we were talking, I asked him, so has God given you any clarity on this painful thing you went through last year? I mean, any clarity at all? And he speaks much more wisely about this than he did at the end of last year when I last talked to him. But the wise things he said a couple things, and one of them was, now let me just go to the big one. The big one, he looked at me and he says, I was praying to God and asking God what happened and who's at fault here. Like, am I at fault? Is the leadership of the church at the fault? I mean, who's at fault here? He says, I was praying about that. And he says, it's as though God said to me, as though Jesus looked me in the eyes and said, well, maybe I did that to you. It stunned me because I thought, yes, in a real way, God will allow injustices to encroach on our life when he opens up the boundary protections and lets them come in because he knows that something made of pure gold is going to happen in your life as a result. Now, that's not justifying injustice, but it is saying that it's still, even though it's unjust and there's a lot of bad things about it, there's something where God can take the most disgusting and horrible things that happen around you and in you and say, but I have great plans for you in your life. And I make all things work together for good. God, who did this to me? Well, Tom, maybe I did this to you. Yeah, and that's actually the case. As we run on this track, as we find the obstacles we come across, there will be great injustices. There will be people shouting us down for what we believe. There will just be injustice. It's not just a smooth road. And you can always analyze it after the fact and try and figure out who's responsible for this so you can blame them. But in the end, if it provides for you such great good, just let it go. Like, for instance, Jesus went to the cross. Did you see him at any time saying, well, God, who did this to me? And this just is not fair. This is not fair. Well, it wasn't fair. This is not just. No, it's not just. I mean, everything about it is is wrong. It's unjust. It's ungodly. Everything that happened to him is ungodly. And yet, God allowed it for the greatest good ever. So when you hit those bumps, maybe that's what's going on. So God did not endorse the sinfulness of those who crucified his son. But God used it in this massively mysterious ability to turn bad into great good. And that's what he's doing in you. That's what he's saying right here. So, for instance, we had the heroes in faith in chapter 11. And he does a summary at the end of it. It says, man, I've run out of time telling about all these people. But these people I'm quoting to you because they exercise faith in that goal, in that end, in that eternity with God himself. That's what they vested their goal in, is right there. So they went through all this stuff in their life, and they willingly lost everything they owned, and they suffered persecution. They willingly did that in this place right here, in the middle of the track run. They allowed themselves to be put under that kind of junk because their faith said the best is yet to be. That's what these guys in chapter 11 are. They're ones who have their eyes on that goal. And he's saying, so should we. And by the way, when you hit bumps in the road, it's by God's design. If you're his child, they're actually part of his discipline. Let's look more at that, because that's an interesting thing. Besides this, he says, we've had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them, right? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seems best to them, but he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. So this is his point. He disciplines us for our good. That is, the things that we probably would not have chosen for ourselves. But due to the twists and turns in life, he brings good to us. But this holiness thing, again, you gotta go back when you read the word holiness and don't just think sinless. I mean, that's an aspect of holiness. But the core of the holiness word is to be set apart for a purpose. It means set apart. And so it literally means to be more extracted out of the sin and contamination of this place. So when Jesus says, he prays for his disciples, he prays, I'm sending them into this world, but Father, they're not of this world, but I'm putting them in this world. That not of this world, that's what he's talking about when he's talking about holiness. Set apart, taken out of this. So when you talk about holy, and even that God is holy, it means that he is not here contaminated by the cesspool of sin that so radically and so pervasively coats everything, including ourselves. He's not touched by that. He's out of that. He's set apart. He's not part of that. And anything that's holy is set apart from that. So when he says that these discipline things he's doing is for our good, okay, I'll warrant that because I can look back and verify that. It has been for my great good. But for my set apartness. And now he's introducing a great idea here, because what he's saying is, while we run the track of life, when we run across obstacles in that track, we're tempted to stop the race because the obstacles are so severe. We're tempted to. And what we're saying basically is that this earth is my home. I want to stay in this place. And if my running toward my eternal destiny with Jesus is going to cause this kind of hassle, I think I'd rather just turn off into the infield and set up my lawn chair and stay here rather than run off to someplace else. See what he's saying? So he says, what I'm trying to do is get you a little bit more extracted out of this place. That's the holiness part. I want you a little less connected here, is what I want, so that your hopes and your aspirations are there and they're not here. That's what the discipline does for holiness, for set apartness. That's a great idea. What he's saying, and he'll expand it just a little bit in a second, but he's saying that there's something about the trials and troubles that we go through in life that not only bring good into our character and how he changes us, that the big religious word is sanctification for that, but also it makes us a little less connected here and a little more connected there. And that's important as you run the race, to stay on the track, to run the race, to aim at the goal, who's Jesus himself, rather than saying, nah, don't want to do that, too much hassle, too hard, I'll stay here. Holiness is to disconnect us from here. Okay, so he goes on. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. I like this kid. I have about 7 pictures of this kid doing different things. A little bit because he looks a lot like I did in my childhood pictures. It's a little strange. But for the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. Well, yeah, okay. However, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who've been trained by it. Yes. Now that's a funny phrase. It says he's going to bring good and holiness, but peaceful fruit of righteousness. What an odd phrase. I'd rather just said, it yields in us righteousness, because sanctification is that process of weeding out the junk and building and supporting the stuff that's good, that's more like God's character. It's righteousness. That sounds good to me. But the peaceful fruit of righteousness. Why would I not be at peace that suddenly the problems afterwards bring me peace? Well, that's the whole point he's saying. When you're in the midst of the discipline and you're in the midst of the hurdles, they don't bring peace. If you're like mine, when I looked at my hurdles, I go, boy, right in the middle of those, I am not at peace. God, what is going on? This is unjust. Am I alone on this? I'm getting these strange stares like, I don't know what you're talking about. And Satan tempts you to try and blame God for the circumstance that's going on. To say, well, I'm a righteous dude, and I don't really deserve this kind of treatment, and this is just wrong. I can tell you 5 ways in which this is unjust, and I can tell you all the seamy, sin-obsessed motivations of all the people involved in that train wreck. So God, why is this happening? Now I'm not at peace. However, after you get past it, after you actually grow some in your dependence on God, and you understand that you're his child, and so he's disciplining you, he's changing something that's worth more than gold in your life, and you come past that, you can look back on that and be at peace that God used that kind of situation to change you so profoundly. Another personal story. A lot of you know we went to Spokane a couple weeks ago, middle of April, and we went back to the place that fired me 20 years ago. To the same church. Now, there were no sin issues involved in that, but it's a very complicated story, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but it was a train wreck in every measure. It was, without a question, it was a train wreck by every measure. And in many ways, as it's kind of receded into the past on my timeline, I've continued to pray and say, God, I'm supposed to probably glean more out of this experience. I'm not sure I've got all the lessons yet. So over the 20 years, I looked at it, I examined it, and I haven't gotten too many answers. A little bit insight here and there. I want to make sure that such a painful experience ends up doing its maximum in me. So that's what I was praying for God. Say, God, I don't want any of this experience to go to waste. And so here I am 20 years, second guessing, reanalyzing, mostly coming up with no really great answers. All I can say is the train came off the tracks right there. Now, I've mentioned this before because God used that to get me here, to get us here. And that's something I'm profoundly thankful for. I mean, profoundly thankful for, because in my ignorance, I would never have chosen to come here. But God said, oh, no, you don't understand. This is for your good. You'll like this. But as we went back to Spokane 2 weeks ago, God, in a very merciful way, closed the book on my wonderings about that whole train wreck. And I can't describe all the ways, but God did it in multiple ways. And so now I can look back at the train wreck and just say, well, that's what that was. But now I have the peaceful fruit of righteousness. And so I can be thankful for the train wreck without having to completely unwind exactly what happened. And I'm at peace. Now, I was at peace for 20 years, pretty much. Until, you wake up in the middle of the night and you think, well, wait a second, what about this? And the peace goes away. You know what I'm talking about. Somehow, in ways that I cannot fully describe, God closed the books. And so when I read this phrase this week, I went, yes, peaceful fruit of righteousness. It's peaceful in another way as well. And this is probably the most obvious way. Not just because my heart's at peace, but because I was constantly blaming people in the process. And in blaming other people in the process, because I could say, well, that's what they did and that was wrong and I can prove it. And so I am at war with those people. I'm not at peace with those people even 20 years after the fact. I'm still at war with some of those people. And so God has to actually shut down the degree to which I'm still at war with those who are involved in the train wreck. And I can finally put my heart at rest and at peace with even those people. Now, look, you don't have to go through that many train wrecks in your life to realize that injustice will happen to you and it'll be out of your control and it will be unfair. It will be unfair. Now, we can lose our peace, we can go all crazy and blaming someone else, or we can sit back, and that's what he's saying here. We can push back just a little bit and say, okay, I've just been visited by injustice. However, I'm going to remember the fact that God disciplines the ones he loves and who are his children. And I'm just going to put this in that category. And I'm going to hold off doing any kind of blaming. And I'm going to rest in the fact that God allowed this for my good. And so that in the end, I'll result in a peaceful righteousness. That's what I'm aiming my goal at. I'm not going to try and assign blame. I'm just going to let that be. That's the attitude we have to take. And that's what he says right here. The guys that he listed in chapter 11 were people who put up with much worse than we will ever put up with. And yet they persisted on to the goal of eternity. He says that's what we need to be. You need to stay on the track. Don't get diverted. Jump the hurdles. Put the hurdles behind you. And continue to keep your eyes on Jesus. And don't ever be tempted to think that the hurdle is because Jesus has stopped loving me. He disciplines those whom he loves, okay? See it as positive, not negative. Therefore, what are we supposed to do? Well, therefore, lift your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees, make straight paths for your feet. He's using great athletic metaphors right here in the race. He's saying, look, so if you're determined to stay on the track and to aim at the goal, who's Jesus? Well, then, get everything in line, just like an athlete would. An athlete stretches, gets ready, goes down in the chalks, sprints out and like that. I mean, act like you're an athlete on a track that's aiming at a goal, and the goal is Jesus. Make your body ready for that. That's all he's saying right here in expanding the metaphor. Run like that. Run like that. And so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. So he's saying that whatever it is you're dealing with that kind of hobbles you, lame, well, you're running the race. So do what it takes to run the race. From what you can control, from who you are and who you're aiming at. Be careful how you run the race so you don't put it out of joint, and be healed and ask God to heal you. And this is very much what I pray when I'm going through train wrecks or I'm way past train wrecks is, God, this thing has hamstrung me. Hey, look at that. It's a track metaphor. This thing has hamstrung me, and I don't want it to do that anymore because I want to run the race well as I come to you. So God, will you heal that lame part of me that came from that experience? See it? It's a great metaphor. I ask God all the time, take these things and put them behind me because I don't want them to stop my race toward you. And yet they will. They can. So here's how you do that. Here's some specific examples. So he says, for instance, 14, strive for peace with everyone and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. Holiness, again, that's that set apartness. But strive for peace with everyone. Train wrecks do not bring peace with me and the people who brought the train wrecks. I'm more, and we mentioned this before, I more want to actually pursue hurting those people as much as I can so that they will become aware in a righteous way and a divine understanding through my wrath that they have sinned against God. It's all about the principle of the thing. No, don't do that. You need to be at peace with everyone. Even in the midst of the train wrecks? Dude, even in the midst of the train wrecks. You need to be at peace. Because you know what it does? It keeps you from focusing on that, on the eternal destiny. And in a way, it actually keeps us connected to this place because you're going to nurture that indignation for the time. Jesus is saying, look, if you want to get to the end, you need to cut those little strings of indignation. Just keep going this way. It'll keep you here. Remember, he said it makes you holy, more set apart. You will not be set apart from this place the more you hold grudges against all the people who've done you dirt. You need to aim toward the goal. That's the discipline of race. The holiness, the set apartness, which no one will see the Lord. And he goes on, some practical examples of running the race. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. Well, that's a funny thing to mention, but it's a good thing to mention. And he doesn't say, look at it, he doesn't say, see to it that you don't fail to obtain the grace of God, but that basically in a larger sense, that everyone around you, it's like not just you, but the people around you understand the grace of God. Now, how in the world, during the midst of a train wreck, can you demonstrate the grace of God when you have been so badly suffered from injustice? How can you demonstrate the grace of God? Yeah. So we know this. I mean, those are all great, Mike. We know this. We know how to demonstrate the grace of God in the midst of a train wreck. But do we? No, I'd rather model the vengeance of God myself. God's going to get you for what you've done. And let me just be really clear about what you've done. Do you know what you've done? Do you have an idea of what you've done? Do you know how dissatisfied God is with you because of what you've done? The vengeance of God is coming for you. The wrath of God. Grace of God. You need to, and this is only through his Spirit that lives in you, you've got to say, God, I want to demonstrate your grace in the train wreck. I have prayed this so many times, and I am just totally incapable of demonstrating the grace of God. I'm better now, I think. But you know what I'm talking about. When you're in the midst of injustice and you don't lash out and you pray, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. That's what Jesus prayed in the midst of a train wreck on the cross. The grace of God. Now, it doesn't mean to ignore injustice, but it does mean that when it comes to the personal harm that comes to you, is to signal grace. It's a signal of grace. Because after all of us have sinned and walked away from God. There's none that's righteous, no, not one. We have all in our own personal ways offended God in a terrible way. This Creator who gave us so much, gave us all. We have all been in the position of being the offenders. And yet we have come to understand the grace of God in terms of he gives us his love and forgiveness through what Christ has done for us. We, of anyone on the planet, ought to be able to communicate grace in the midst of train wrecks. And when that happens, well, and again, you gotta pray, God, I can't do this, but you can. Demonstrate who you are through this. Then people look at you and they don't understand why you didn't lash out. You're suddenly demonstrating the core nature of who God is. Grace in the face of offense. And they can say, why are you like this? And you can say, because I have received the tremendous grace of God in the face of my wretched abuses toward God. I understand his grace. It's a tremendous gift. And so we're letting that go. Grace is such a powerful testimony to who God is in the midst of a people who claw and fight each other all the time. And when it comes to your doorstep, pray that God can demonstrate his grace through you. Again, it's without question, it's supernatural. It's supernatural that he can do that. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God. And here's an interesting one. Part of this discipline and running on the track is that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. Train wrecks cause a root of bitterness. I did it. I mean, you've probably done it. You look at the train wreck and you become bitter because it's so unjust. And what it does, what a great picture. It's like a root. Dandelions are the things that come to my mind. You know, if you clip off the top of dandelions, they still come back. You got to get the root out. Well, bitterness is like a root that stays under the ground. It can be kind of hidden for a while, but it's still there, and you're still bitter. And then when the right time happens, it sprouts, and all kind of nasty grunge comes out of your mouth against this person. See to it that these roots of bitterness, which could have been formed in the train wreck, in the hurdles on the track, this bitterness, make sure you dig those babies out. Just like dandelions, they'll spring up. Make sure that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it, many become defiled. Oh, gosh. That last line just breaks my heart because I've seen it happen many times where there's usually an unconscious fault on someone's part against someone else. I mean, they didn't do something bad out of malice or out of a plan. They just unintentionally, unconsciously hurt somebody else. And that may have happened to you. And so you can plant that as a root of bitterness. But I'll tell you, when that thing has a chance to sprout, you can spread some vile stuff amongst the people that it affects, and it literally defiles them. So he's saying part of the process of you pulling up out of this place, holiness, and refocusing on the promise revealed in Christ, part of that is digging up those roots that are getting ready to spring out and defile people. Just pull them out. Just pull them out. That's what you need to do. Also, when it comes to pulling out those roots of bitterness, you know, the bitterness says, I've been wronged. And someone needs to fix this. I've been wronged. Well, many times you don't verbalize it. That's at the root stage. But then when something triggers it, then we do verbalize it. And many people are defiled. because you have been hurt. Forgiveness, the first step in forgiveness is saying, I will let the root stay there, but not today. Forgiveness says, I'm pulling it out and I'll no longer bring it up. I'll no longer let it spring. God does this with us. I mean, when he forgives us, he doesn't say, well, now. You did offend me greatly because your sinfulness and your independence. I'm your creator, you're the creation, look what you've done. He doesn't say I've forgotten about it. All it says he forgets. But what he's done is he says in the forgetting and the dropping into the sea, what he's saying is, I'm not going to be non-omniscient about your sin. I know you sin. What I'm going to do is say, we're not going to bring it up anymore. That is, it'll never be between us. That will never be between us. It's as though it's been dropped in the depths of the sea. It's as though I can't even remember him. That's what it's like. Now, between you and another person, if someone harms you in a train wreck situation, it might be deliberate or might not be deliberate, you can get to a point where you say to yourself, I will not let this issue come between us. However, the opposite of that, when you don't forgive, is you say, yeah, next time I see them, I am going to read them the riot act. They're here, I'm here, and I'm going to say, you know what you did? You're going to put this between the two of you, and it's going to separate you, because that kind of offense separates. I'm going to nurture that. I'm going to really let that separate. I'm going to push this wedge in between us, and we cannot have fellowship as long as that thing's there. Until they grovel, until they admit what they've done, until they come before me and say, oh, Joe, I'm so sad, I didn't really mean it, until they really grovel as low as possible, then I might let it go away. No. What forgiveness says is, let's just pull it out of there. Why? For the purpose of maintaining the relationship. Because the offenses, the bitterness, prevent relationship. That's what it does. And he's saying you need to just pull it out. Or else that root will spring into a wonderful dandelion, and it'll cause great defilement among everyone around you. And all it'll do is make you feel good. Let go of it. That's one way we disconnect from this world. And then also that no one is sexually immoral. That's actually something that connects us to this world, is sexual immorality. 1 John 2, he talks about the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the boastful pride of life. And then all around it. Go back and read. No, we're going to read that right now. Doggone it! I forgot to put it up here. But this is why sexual immorality tends to keep us connected to this place, because it has an alluringness to it. It has a way in which it keeps us here, and it makes us actually wish we stayed here. This lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh and the boastful pride of life. 1 John 2. 1 John 2. I went too far. Sorry, I would have put this on the slide if I had any thinking this week. I was at 14. There we go. Thanks. Yeah. 1 John 2:15. Listen to how you're connected to the world because of sexuality. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And look, the world is passing away with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. That captures perfectly what he's talking about here. There are some things that allure us to this place, and much of it is sexuality, it turns out. And he's saying, don't let that keep you from this focus at the end of life. Now, let me do a caveat right here. Sex is something that God created, and it's a wonderful thing in the right context. It is a wonderful thing with a capital W. Out of context, it can be horrible. If the same act can cause wonderful intimacy, and in the wrong context, it can cause soulish scars for life, then you realize we're dealing with something extraordinarily powerful here. But it can be, in its good context, one of the best things God gives us. So I'm not poo-pooing that. But what he's talking about is sexual immorality. That's pushing it out in the area where it's actually quite dangerous and self-destructive. That's what he's talking about. And the allure of that, which John said, is these desires, this lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, boastful pride. That's what keeps us connected here to a certain degree. And in the end, people, instead of loving God and who he is, end up loving his creation in the sexual realm. They love the created thing rather than the creator himself. So we could talk for hours on this, but I won't. But he's just saying this is one thing that connects us here. Just be wary of it. And then he brings up the most unlikely thing. Out of all, I was expecting to do a whole list of things don't do. I mean, these things you need to be gracious. You need to be hospitable. You need to disconnect from this place by being more like God in here. I mean, and then he goes to Esau. What in the world? So let's spend a few minutes on Esau, because I think this is one of his greatest intellectual coups in the entire book of Hebrews. Now remember, the context is he wants us to increasingly disconnect from this place so that our focus is on the eternal, the promise fulfilled, right? From the temporary to the eternal. So listen to Esau. I don't want you to be unholy like Esau. Now remember, holy means set apart. What he's saying is that Esau was not set apart from this place. Somehow he was rooted here that he shouldn't have been. Here he goes. He's unset apart. This Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. And we see birthright right there. We're thinking actually an internal inheritance, the promise that came from Abraham that was going to go through Abraham's seed and go all the way out, bless the world, all that kind of stuff. This was going to go through the sons. So he's saying he sold his birthright, which is the eternal promise fulfilled through him. He sold that for a single stinking meal. Now he's starting to make the contrast. You see the contrast? Esau invested in a very temporary thing and did not aim at the eternal promise anymore. That was the birthright. That was the inheritance that was coming through him. Like that wasn't going to happen. Look, we'll just review the story a little bit. Here we go. If you go back to Genesis 25. Once, when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Hey, let me eat some of that stew. I'm exhausted." Scintillating dialogue, okay? Well, Jacob said, sensing an opportunity, "Sell me your birthright." That is, if you want some of my stuff, you want some of my good smelling stew, why don't you take your role in the eternal promise, the inheritance that's coming, that's going to go on, that forward-looking inheritance, why don't you sell that to me instead? Because you remember, Jacob and Esau were twins, fraternal twins. And Esau was older as the twin because he came out first. And yet Jacob came out really close behind. He was grabbing on to the heel of Esau, remember, as he comes out. So they're actually fraternal twins. There's a lot of great theology of dualism here that we won't get into. It's really fascinating. But all he's just going to talk about is the fact that at this point, Esau had temporal needs and saw a temporal fix in that stew and decided to sell off that entire future in exchange for that. What an incredible swap of the temporary for the eternal, is what he's saying. So Jacob senses an opportunity. By the way, Jacob's name has some Hebrew connections into the word to cheat. So sensing an ability here to cheat, well, sell me your birthright now. And Esau said, well, I'm about to die, so what use is a birthright to me? Trading off the temporal for the eternal. Well, okay. And so Jacob said, okay, you got to swear to me now. Cross your heart, hope to die. You are going to do this. You're going to give it to me. So he swore to him and sold his birthright, his link into the eternal promise. He sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate, and he drank, and he rose, and went his way, like nothing has happened. And he took that temporary solution, which is going to come and go, and tomorrow he's going to be hungry again, and swapped it for the entire timeline of the promise of God. See what a horrible trade that was? That's why the writer of Hebrews is saying, let me illustrate this with the most heinous example I can think of in the Old Testament, where you're so connected into the now that you take that and you diminish it to nothing. What a horrible swap. What a horrible swap. Thus, Esau despised his birthright. He looked at the fruition of those promises that started from Abraham and Isaac and then came through to him, and he says, that's not going to happen. I'm going to die anyway. I think I'd rather have a bowl of soup. What disdain for the promises of God. What disdain. And the writer of Hebrews says, afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. For he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. I mean, he realized his error. And it happens after Jacob does this switcheroo with his father. His father's going to invoke the blessing on him, which will actually, in a sense, transfer this eternal blessing coming from Abraham and Isaac and into Jacob. And he does it by cheating. Again. However, it's interesting because God wanted Jacob to be in that position. Jacob, being a scallywag and a cheat, believed in the value of that promise, even though he was a dirtbag. And God used his sinfulness to bring about what God wanted to happen all the time. Again, one of these train wrecks that happen where there's a lot of injustice, there's a lot of sin in the midst of the issue. I mean, Jacob's a dirtbag. He's a sinful guy, is what he's doing. But in the end, God uses that for good because that's where God wanted to go anyway. Not with Esau, but with Jacob. That's another fascinating discussion about the sovereignty of God. However, he says that even in the end, once he realized the error of his ways, he couldn't reverse it. He had made his choice. He had decided that the eternal promises of God and the blessing that was going to come through him was worth nothing in compared to a bowl of soup. I can't imagine anything so repugnant to God. But here's the issue. That's what we do. That's what we do. I don't know. I like all this stuff right here. I think I'd rather stay here and do this kind of stuff. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the boastful pride of life. I think I'd rather do all this kind of stuff. Maybe that really doesn't factor in terms of being as worthy as this right here. And so we trade off the promises of the eternal life with God for temporary things that are going to come and go. What are we thinking? What are we thinking? Now, if you're looking at me saying, gosh, Jim, you are really weird. Does that happen to you? Well, it happens to all of us. Because when he says this desire, this lust, it's actually these things we put our hopes in right now is saying, this is what provides life for me. That doesn't provide life for me. This provides life for me. I can touch and feel and taste this. This makes sense. And yet what he's saying is that if you're running the race toward Jesus and the fulfillment of his promises for us for life, you're going to detach from these things and realize they're just going to come and go. Don't let them trip you up. Don't let them surround your ankles and keep you from running. You just need to say, in its context, that's okay. But what I'm looking forward to is this, the fulfilled promises of God for life for me. That's what I'm looking forward to. That's what drives me on the track to deal with the hurdles, to deal with the train wrecks, to push forward, to have him more and more pull me out of this place gradually as we go through these things. That's the holiness factor. That's the sanctification factor. Pull me slowly out of this place so that when I get to the brink of that happening for me, which might be my death, when I get to the brink of that, I'll look back at all this stuff and say, yeah, that can go. That can go. Rich Mullins wrote a great song called Elijah. If you haven't heard it, I recommend you go back. It's an old song. But he talks about Elijah, and he uses this metaphor that Elijah is on the brink of being with God like that, and he looks back on all the things of his life, the good and the bad, but mostly the good, and he says, it'll be like a candlelight in Central Park. It'll just fade off as a tiny light. And I'll say, that was okay, but this is what I've been aiming for my entire life. This is what I've been aiming for. And that's what he said everyone in chapter 11 did. And he says that's what we need to do, is continue to look toward Jesus, because he does that. Okay, well, let's quit for this morning. I want to show you a quote. Randy Alcorn many years ago out of Portland. And he talks about this connection we have with the world and how it keeps us from our focus on what God gives to us. So let's listen to how he says this. He who lays up treasures on earth spends his life backing away from his treasures. To him, death is loss. He who lays up treasures in heaven looks forward to eternity. He's moving daily toward his treasures. To him, death is gain. And he who spends his life moving toward his treasures has reason to rejoice. So, are you despairing or are you rejoicing? Especially with the things that are here. Now, I don't want to diminish our time here. God has left us here for purpose. And that purpose largely is to glorify who God is and that God can use us to draw people to himself so that we're not alone on this path to this great fruition of what he provides for us. We can actually be positive influences toward that. And that's why we're here. Many times in the midst of the train wrecks of life, I wish that God would kind of take me out now. God, Kirk to Scotty, beam me up. Let's go. I'm ready. This is a bad place right here. No. But what he's saying right here is that there are things that tend to keep us here, and we need to be dutiful here because God has a great plan between now and eternity, not only to draw many people to himself through you, but also to gradually disconnect you from this place and build in you a character that's like him, so that in the end, we'll look more like Jesus than we ever thought was ever possible. And by the way, it's the train wrecks that he's going to use to do that. It's the train wrecks. So quit whining about your train wrecks. Quit fantasizing about who caused them and who you can blame. Quit thinking about going on Twitter and saying the nastiest things you can think of these people. Let it go. Disconnect from this place. This is temporary. And keep your eyes on the goal. That finish flag at the end of the track is Jesus and his promises to us. And keep your eyes there. And then let these things pass. And like Rich Mullins says, it'll be like a fading candle in Central Park, just far off. Because this is what I want. Jesus. I want Jesus. So be dutiful from now until then. Deal with the train wrecks. Go to God in your pain and anguish because it's not fun. That's what he's saying here. But realize that he's promised to you something that will not be fulfilled here. But you can start to taste it here because he's put his spirit in you. And you can rely on his spirit to get you through these things. You can relate to him in relationship now, but much more fully then. But your course toward the end of this isn't just one of sacrifice right now. It's of growing and deepening relationship with God in the midst of the difficulties. And the foretaste of glory divine. That's what he wants you to do. Don't get hung up here, but be godly while you're here. And keep a loose hand on the offenses. Forgive quickly. Love massively. Demonstrate grace in the midst of train wrecks. And people will come to understand that you are a child of someone they can't see, a child of the Father who's done that for all of us. And so as a result, we're going to sing. What are we going to sing? Oh, one last picture. Now, I got to tell you, I tried to find the most attractive and alluring bowl of lentil soup I could find. Because I happen to love lentil soup. And that's great for today. But in comparison to that's just a bowl of lentil soup. What an egregious thing that Esau did that warns us so powerfully. Don't trade stuff now for that. That's the real life. And again, I brought this up I don't know how many times. The hiding place, right? Corrie ten Boom and her sister Betsy, and they're in Birkenbauer prison through World War II because they sheltered Jews in their house. They're not Jews; they're believers in Jesus. And while they're at the prison camp, Betsy, who eventually dies, Corrie writes so much about Betsy just having her act together. She seemed, you're going through all this bad stuff, like a bigger train wreck than many of us probably will ever experience, being in a concentration camp. And the two sisters are together through this. And Corrie writes continuously through The Hiding Place how Betsy just seems to be sort of above it. She seems to not be affected by it all. There's something about her attitude that even though she sees the brutality of what's going on there, it doesn't seem to dispel her hope in what Jesus has for us there. And that's why all through the book, Corrie kept quoting what she heard from Betsy while she was in camp. The best is yet to be. This concentration camp isn't the end. And all of our experience here isn't the end. That's the end. And that's Jesus in fullness in our lives. So Betsy could just kind of hover over this stuff and let the train wrecks happen and just keep pushing forward as she ran on the track to Jesus. So look, if you haven't read Hiding Place yet, shame on you. I've quoted it 100 times. It's a great book. Oh my gosh, a great book. Okay, now we're going to sing this. Because in running this race, you can't do it in your own flesh. You need him. You need him. But in the process, he's not going to insulate you from train wrecks. They're still going to happen. But in the middle of the depth of that train wreck, in the deepest pit possible, and Corrie ten Boom said this too, no matter how deep the pit is, God's grace is deeper still. His love is deeper still. he can reach where you are. So you need him in all of this stuff. Or, as Winston Churchill said, I'm full of quotes today. Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. And I would say, when you're going through hell, keep going and put your trust in Jesus and keep your eyes on him. Okay? Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for these passages. Lord, it's somewhat convicting how easily I attach myself to the temporary stuff here, to the stuff that'll come and go. And Lord, I'm not making excuse for the fact that there are things here in this creation that represent who you are and they're glorifying. I look at these mountains so nearby and I think about the glory of your strength and your majesty. There are so many things here that you've embedded into this creation that cause me to come back to you. Sunrises that make me glorify you. And those things are just incredible. They're just incredible. But Lord, they only invite me to aim my eyes at the fuller revelation at the end of the age of who you are, to see you face to face. And we'll look back at the mountains and their grandeur and the sunrises and say, well, those were good, but this is what I've placed my hope on my entire life. To be with Jesus, to be with him face to face, to be with what Zacharias called the sunrise from on high. And Lord, that's what we look forward to, is to see you and to be with you. So Lord, practically speaking, as we run this race, as we're on this track, as we have so many who've gone before us who look down on us and who cheer us on, we pray that as we approach train wrecks, that you would make our hearts more like you in the process. And that as our actions follow these transformed hearts, that people would notice that there's something different, that they'd notice that there is a God indeed who loves and who forgives and who has sacrificed in our behalf. A God who came in the flesh, who himself suffered the greatest train wreck of history and brought the great good to all mankind. Lord, make us those kind of messengers through what we do. And Lord, lastly, I hate to say this, but we give you permission to bring more train wrecks into our life. Not that you need it, but we anticipate that they'll happen because you are a Father who disciplines. And in that discipline, you bring us good and you make us less connected to this place so that our hearts will instead connect to you. Thank you for your great love, even in the midst of the deepest places. And thank you for the unspeakable riches of your presence with us in your Spirit. So thanks now in Jesus' name. Amen. Oh, sorry.
Why don't you stand? Thanks.